Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. On today's review show, we will be discussing Israel's flower massacre from last week, a US airdrop, and asking if the White House has any influence over Netanyahu, and what does that mean for US so-called the US's image around the world. We'll talk about Hamas and Fatah talks in Moscow and negotiations in Cairo as well. And could we see an Israeli invasion of Lebanon? That's what a number of US officials are fearing at the moment. And why would President Biden risk re-election to continue his support for Israel? That's in relation to the US elections in Michigan, where 100,000 decided to not support the Democratic candidate. So we have lots more to go through. And let's begin with, Moin, if I may, with Gaza. We've been watching, of course, the horrific scenes coming out of death resulting from malnutrition and famine. One UNRWA official, said yesterday that children in Gaza Strip are dying slowly before our eyes. But the thing is, there's enough aid, there's enough stockpiles of aid for the 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. It's just in Cairo, it's just a few miles away. So do you think Israel is using famine then as a weapon of war?
Well, I think not only is Israel using essential humanitarian supplies as a weapon of war, it has on repeated occasions explicitly said that it would be doing this. And I think it was the World Food Program that this week issued a statement saying that this was essentially the most rapid transition towards man-made famine in history that they have recorded. I think there's two things going on here. The first is an Israeli desire for revenge, for collective punishment, to punish the entire population of the Gaza Strip for October 7th. Not only, because Israel recognizes no distinction between civilians and combatants, as was made very clear in the South African application to the International Court of Justice, referencing numerous statements in this regard, but also because Israel believes that by essentially razing the Gaza Strip to the ground and engineering famine and disease and all the rest of it, that this will deter not only Hamas in Gaza and other Palestinians from ever thinking of raising their heads against Israel again, but it will also deter other Israeli adversaries and enemies. The coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, others who may be thinking that Israel can and should be confronted, and so on. Of course, it's from that perspective, it's going to be quite counterproductive, because I believe what we're actually seeing is a transition among people who believe that peace with Israel may be possible, but no longer desirable. So in terms of the aid that you're discussing, yes, there is sufficient amounts of aid stuck on the Egyptian side of the Egyptian-Palestinian border, and that is not getting in. The primary reason, and according to everyone responsible for aid delivery, the overwhelmingly primary reason is Israeli policy of refusing to let these goods enter, or reducing them to an absolute minimum that doesn't even begin to address the needs of the population of the Gaza Strip, slow walking everything, and not less importantly, shooting up aid convoys and then massacring Palestinians who were seeking to access that aid that does get in, as we saw in Gaza City several days ago, and then again in Deir el-Balah more recently. There is, of course, also an Egyptian role in this, but I do think we have to see the Egyptian role as reflecting not an independent policy decision, by Egypt to starve the Gaza Strip, but very much as a function of Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, so in response to the humanitarian catastrophe we're seeing, the US announced last week that it will be dropping humanitarian aid via, airdrops. Um, but the thing is that many will say, Biden can simply pick up the phone and insist and demand Netanyahu to open up the gates, open up the channels to deliver aid. Why go through all this trouble of dropping aid from the air when you can deliver it, of course, through a convoy via the roads or by sea as well? One stat I saw, one airdrop is equivalent to one truck. One truck is nothing. So why go through all this process and really show American weakness and ineffectiveness when it comes to its influence over Netanyahu?
Well, in fact, the statements that I saw differ slightly from what you just said, which is that one airdrop is in fact less than one truck could take into the Gaza Strip. But that's a minor detail. You mentioned that Biden could pick up the phone and demand and insist that Israel open land corridor into the Gaza Strip. It's not even that complicated. It would require no more than Biden picking up the phone and informing the Israeli government that as of this moment, aid will be provided on an unrestricted basis throughout the Gaza Strip. And it will be. It really is that simple. And I think, I think there are several aspects to the airdrop. I think first and foremost, that their primary purpose is political rather than humanitarian, in the sense that what the United States is trying to do is to engage in this circus, in this diversionary charade, in this exercise in smoke and mirrors, the primary purpose of which is not to deliver humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, but to legitimize the siege that is making such aid necessary, to divert our view from not only the severe malnutrition in the Gaza Strip and the incipient famine that has already caused, I think, more than a dozen children their lives, but the imminent famine throughout the Gaza Strip. So we're not supposed to look at the ground and see what's actually happening. We're supposed to look up at the air and watch these planes drop expired meals ready to eat. I think, the second, and it's really obscene, to it's I've compared it to a doctor placing a band-aid over a metastasizing tumor and then claiming that as a breakthrough in medical science. It's really obscene. I mean, 38,000 meals dropped for a population of more than 2 million people, which is in the first stages of famine. I think the second reason has to do with initiatives at both the Security Council and the International Court of Justice. Again, trying to minimize the impact of reality on the bodies that are considering these things and seeking to provide some support for an American draft resolution at the Security Council, which once again tries to get around the issue of an immediate opening of land corridors and a ceasefire. And the third aspect, I think, has to do with, and we'll be speaking about this in more detail later, but the Michigan primary, where a much higher number of voters than anticipated felt that they could not vote for Biden, even though he has no significant opponent, and voted uncommitted. Now, it's not going to make a difference for the primary or for the nomination for the Democratic Party, but if across the country, and particularly in Michigan, similar numbers of people choose to vote uncommitted or not vote at all in November, Biden is going to have a real problem.
What's further maddening about all this is that what the Israelis are doing in blocking aid, of course, they're rejecting that claim, but they definitely are, is that it's undermining, it goes against US law. There's a US law, the Foreign Assistance Act, which basically says that if US supplies aid and assistance to a country and that country blocks American aid being delivered to a war zone, then the president can withdraw support from that country. What the president should withdraw support from that country. So in this case, with the Israelis blocking US aid being dropped in Gaza, then by US law itself, American president should stop any further assistance to Israel until Israel says that it will allow American aid to be distributed in Gaza Strip. So it's more than just simply politics. It's also contravenes American law, and why an American president refuses to uphold American law itself on this issue is further adds to the claim that America is really incompetent when it comes to dealing with Israel.
Well, first of all, I think what you've said is precise and correct about the legal aspect. And secondly, I think what this crisis confirms once again is that when it comes to foreign policy, at least, the United States has as little regard for its own domestic laws as it does for international law. But I don't think this is a reflection of US weakness vis-a-vis Israel. I think it's a reflection of the US determination to assist and support Israel at any cost. And one thing this crisis has revealed is that for all the talk about Israel being a regional superpower, about Israel being an outpost of Western interests and a proxy for Western influence in the Middle East, which at a certain level is certainly true, it's also demonstrated the extraordinary, arguably existential dependence of Israel upon the West, and particularly upon the United States in both its military and political and diplomatic dimensions. I would strongly disagree with the proposition that the US wants a change in Israeli policy, but is unable to engineer one. I think it's very clearly a case of the United States having preferences that don't align with those of Israel, but taking a clear policy decision to do nothing about it. In other words, it has made clear to Israel, these are our preferences, but if you ignore them, there will be no consequences, because once again, the US is very deeply invested, and Biden personally in particular, very deeply invested in Israel and Israel's agenda and Israel's success, and has reached the point where there is an incapability among people like Biden, like Blinken, like McGurk, to distinguish between Israeli and American interests. What's good for Israel reflects positively on the United States. Israeli failure reflects poorly on the United States regionally and geopolitically. And again, getting back to the first part of our discussion, it would take no more than a phone call to inform the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant or whoever that as of now, this is how it's going to be. And the fact that they haven't done so, I think, doesn't really, I think, shouldn't be understood in the context of the power of the Israel lobby in the US Congress or any of those issues that we often speak about. It should be seen as a conscious and explicit policy decision by the US government that this is what we want, this is our policy, and we're implementing it. I mean, you know, you speak about Congress, and what you said is entirely right. But let's not forget that the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has now, on 2 occasions already, approved U.S. military aid to Israel that, according to the procedure followed, is not subject to congressional oversight. I think on the positive side, you're beginning to see a growing number of Congress people, still a relatively small number, but growing and increasingly vocal, raising questions about these procedures, raising questions about the US's blind support for Israel and refusal to attach any consequences on Israel, particularly given the rabid extremism of its current government and its explicit opposition and rejection of openly stated US policy preferences.
So going back to the flower massacre from last week, 170 Palestinians were killed, 750 were wounded. And of course, Israel, as I said, has rejected those allegations that it opened fire on Palestinians, desperate Palestinians seeking food. But how much faith do you put on the Israeli claims? That comes on at the same time, in the same week where there was an expectation that Israel would provide evidence of the UN staff alleged to have been taking part in the 7th October attack. Thus far, there's not been any evidence provided by Israel to the UN investigators. So another question about credibility. In the same week as well, there was a number of articles debunking the New York Times claim about 7/7, especially with regards to the allegations of rape as a weapon of war that was used by Hamas. The credibility question has come up again and again and again. Here is another one where Israel is not owning up to the fact that Palestinian witnesses, eyewitnesses themselves have said that they were attacked, targeted. Many have ended up in hospitals with bullet wounds, which is consistent with the descriptions of Palestinians coming under fire from Israeli soldiers. So how much faith do you put on the Israeli claim on the flower massacre?
Well, I think, like any objective person who assesses the history of Israeli claims and measures them against reality, the Israeli military has at best zero credibility when it comes to its spin on events such as this horrific flower massacre several days ago. I think the problem is that despite its history of systematic distortion and outright lies and spin and all the rest of it, that mainstream Western media has a tendency to uncritically repeat Israeli war propaganda and report it as legitimate news unless and until proven otherwise. And often by the time they get to the bottom of the story, it's given much less prominence and the damage is already done. We saw this very clearly, for example, with the Israeli attacks on Al-Shifa Hospital and all their absurd claims. By the time the Washington Post ran a major expose exposing that it was basically invented out of thin air and out of whole cloth, there wasn't very much left of Al-Shifa Hospital. And in this case also, the Israeli claim is that the majority of people who were killed in this massacre died as a result of, I think their term was a stampede by looters seeking to access the aid trucks. And then a small number were shot by the Israeli military as a result of warning shots because they were coming too close to the soldiers. This is, I remember very clearly during the first Intifada, they would routinely say, we were attacked by stone throwing Palestinian youths. we fired warning shots into the air and 2 or 3 of them died. Well, I haven't seen evidence that Palestinians are capable of flight. You know, if you're firing warning shots into the air, how do you end up killing people who were standing on the ground? But others have looked into this. I think even the BBC ended up doing a report about this, showing that in fact, the majority of those killed were killed by snipers. They were not trampled to death, they were shot to death. And the bullets were aimed very clearly at the upper body, at the chest and the head, where they would be the most lethal. And again, this needs to be seen in context rather than in isolation. Israel has a very clear enunciated policy of preventing urgently needed life-saving humanitarian supplies from entering the Gaza Strip. Israel is implementing that policy on the ground. There have been multiple incidents of Israel shooting up aid convoys and even killing people in these convoys. And so Israeli claims need to be understood and analyzed and assessed within this broader context, not on the basis of the lies and propaganda and smear campaigns emanating from Israeli official statements. And then here's the evidence. You know, people were killed by bullets. What, were they shot by those driving the trucks? Were they shot by people trying to get to the aid first? None of it makes any sense. But I think there is also a somewhat disturbing aspect to this entire discussion. Yes, there is a severe Israeli engineered humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. And yes, life-saving humanitarian supplies are needed on an immediate and urgent basis throughout the Gaza Strip, because if they're not delivered, a very large number of people are going to starve to death as a result of famine. But I think we also need to keep focusing on the fact that we're not talking about a drought or some kind of natural disaster, that this is a engineered famine designed to achieve a political objective. And secondly, that there are political roots to this crisis that help explain it. This goes to the other case currently being discussed at the International Court of Justice about the legal status of Israeli rule in these territories. I think when we discuss these issues, we of course should and must focus on the humanitarian aspect, but I think to do so in isolation from the larger issues of the denial of Palestinian self-determination, of the apartheid system that exists throughout the territory of Israel and the occupied territories, you know, of the genocidal onslaught that Israel is carrying out in the Gaza Strip, of Israeli impunity because its Western sponsors in Washington and Brussels have taken a decision that Israel should not, cannot, and will not be held accountable for anything and everything it does to trample Palestinian rights and Palestinians literally underfoot. I think we also need to focus on those core aspects of the current crisis.
You mentioned the status of the occupation. We had a whole discussion last week. So if our viewers want to listen to that, go to last week's discussion where we speak in depth about the ICJ court hearing was underway about the status of Israel's occupation and the illegality of Israel's occupation. So have a listen to that if you want to find out more about that. I want to turn our attention to some of the the changes on the political arena. There's discussions taking place in Moscow between the various Palestinian factions. I mean, my understanding is that that was at the invitation of Putin. So last Friday, various factions from the Palestinian organizations, Fatah, Hamas, and others, were invited to Moscow. What's the likelihood, do you think, that they will agree to some kind of technocratic government? That seems to be the objective at the moment, to form a technocratic government to take over in Gaza. What's the likelihood of that?
I think the likelihood of these discussions in Moscow producing concrete results is unfortunately fairly low. Um, uh, Russia, in the form of the former Soviet Union, has a historic relationship with the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Russian Federation, despite being a member of the Middle East Quartet, has also over the years developed a relationship with Hamas, which, as you know, is not part of the PLO. And Russia has over the years sought to convene various meetings between these rival Palestinian forces. I think there are several reasons that would justify pessimism about the outcome. The first is that Egypt very jealously guards its leading role in sponsoring Palestinian reconciliation talks. And what this means is that Hamas in particular is going to be unlikely to risk antagonizing Egypt by reaching agreements with its Palestinian rivals in other arenas, in this case, Moscow. The second is that if you look at the communique that emerged out of this meeting, it's basically anodyne, very general slogans that for all intents and purposes, do not speak to the issues you and I are now discussing. And the third reason, I think, has to do with the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. It has been my firm conviction for many years now, and I've said this on numerous occasions, that so long as Mahmoud Abbas remains in office and power, there will be and can be no Palestinian national reconciliation or even meaningful formulas that allow for consensus between the rival Palestinian movements. He is simply dead set against it. Agreements will be reached, but he will undermine them. He has zero interest in it, and he is fully invested in the schism, and he will, just as importantly, not risk Israeli and Western hostility if he overcomes the schism. So that's, I think, the most important aspect. Secondly, what's under discussion, you mentioned a technocratic government. Yes, at some levels it certainly is, but I think it's being characterized as a consensus government. In other words, a government that enjoys the support of all the main Palestinian political movements and factions, even if it is not their members who sit in this cabinet and in this government. That, I think, is a formula that makes perfect sense. It's one that I think leading figures in both Hamas and the Fatah movement and elsewhere have accepted. But of course, it's something that Israel and its Western sponsors in Washington and Brussels will hear nothing about because, as far as they're concerned, um, they are the ones who will choose who represents the Palestinians. Palestinian representation is a decision that will be taken in Tel Aviv and Brussels and Washington, and under no circumstances by the Palestinian people themselves.
Yeah, so sticking to negotiations, there's talks in Cairo between Hamas and Israel for a ceasefire. The US has been calling for a ceasefire. Biden and Kamala Harris is the latest, the US vice president, to demand an immediate ceasefire. But many have said, the US is being quite disingenuous here because it's saying that the ball is in the court of Hamas. What does that mean? So again, it seems like Washington is behaving like Israel's lawyer. It's called for a permanent ceasefire, yes, but at the same time, it's placing responsibility for the success of negotiation on the doors of Hamas. And a failure to deliver a ceasefire will be landed on the feet of Hamas. So there seems to, Palestinians, so it seems there is a bit of, sleight of hand at play here right now. Is that how you see it?
Yes, that's exactly right. Um, Washington is basically saying that we have put a proposal on the table. That proposal has been developed in close coordination with the Israelis, and therefore it reflects Israel's agenda. And now the onus is on Hamas. The ball is in Hamas's court. Hamas either accepts Israel's terms or it's responsible for the failure of the negotiations. Of course, the other aspect we have to bear in mind is that the US is an honest broker, a fair mediator, and all the rest of it. I mean, why the US is involved in this, given that it is the most dishonest broker imaginable on the one hand, and has taken a policy decision not to use its leverage with Israel to make these negotiations succeed on the other hand. And I think the only justification for US involvement in these talks would be that the US has influence over Israel and is prepared to use it. Well, it does have influence over Israel, but it's not prepared to use it. So I view the US role in these talks as negative, as sabotaging their prospects for success, unless and until, I mean, forget honest broker. That's pie in the sky. But unless the US is prepared to use its leverage with Israel to make these negotiations succeed, there is absolutely no justification for it being part of these talks. And as far as uh, Kamala Harris and her recent statement is concerned, this gets back, I think, to an earlier part of our discussion about American politicians looking forward to the November elections. Um, it's my sense, and again, I'm not a specialist in these issues, but it's my conviction that Biden is ideologically committed to Israel. And as far as Biden is concerned, if he has to sacrifice his reelection in order to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel, in this case, standing shoulder to shoulder with Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich, and making their agenda his agenda, if that's going to cost him the election, my sense is that he genuinely believes this is a price worth paying. He's prepared to stick up for his principles, happen to be genocidal principles in this particular context. But this for him, this is someone who cut his political teeth during the Cold War. So the ideological component of policy is not new or foreign to him. My sense is that Biden is ideologically committed to the extent that he views this as a principle worth sacrificing his reelection for. There are, of course, others in the Democratic Party who may not give a hoot about Palestinians, who may even have fundamentally pro-Israeli policy positions, but who are seeing the extraordinary and potentially fatal damage that is being inflicted on the Democratic Party's reelection prospects and its ability to control Congress after the November elections. They are the ones, I think, who are beginning to make these noises about, increased humanitarian aid, ceasefire, and all the rest of it. As far as Kamala Harris specifically is concerned, I also wouldn't discount a potential other element that's at play here, which is that Biden's age and cognitive abilities and, other aspects of his fitness for office are becoming increasingly prominent in the selection campaign. And perhaps Harris or those around her closest advisors, perhaps she is being advised that if she were to reemerge from the dead, because she's essentially been invisible for the past 4 years, and begin making these kinds of statements, she can use Gaza as a kind of stepping stone to potentially replace Biden as a Democratic Party's presidential candidate, because there are still a number of months to go before the party has to make a definitive decision about who will represent it in the November elections.
Yeah, we're seeing a bit of that here in the UK as well. I think the longer this goes on, more and more Gaza will become a wedge issue in politics, and especially on the left and center left, you will see politicians trying to exploit the situation to stamp their claim on being a credible, candidate. We will see more of that because polls after polls are showing that more and more young voters are more sympathetic to Palestinians than they are to Israel. So, I mean, I think I have a question about that later on, but I wanted to, before we discuss that in more detail, just touch on some of the regional issues. There was a US official last week said that they were concerned that the Israelis would launch an incursion or invasion of Lebanon. Of course, Israel has been bombing Lebanon for the last many decades, not just last 5 months. What do you think will be the decisive factor in Israel's calculation on whether it re-invades Lebanon or not?
I think there are several aspects here. I think if you look at this objectively, Israel is simply not up to a two-front war. It's been now fighting essentially a second-order militia, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, in this minuscule territory, the Gaza Strip, which is all of 365 square kilometers, for 100 days. I mean, it's approaching half a year, and it still hasn't achieved any of its objectives. Well, it has achieved its objectives of raising large parts of the Gaza Strip to the ground, engineering famine, genocide, and all the rest of it. But I mean, I think in conventional military terms, it hasn't achieved anything of significance to date. That's number one. So, but the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is known as something of a gambler, and my sense is that the Americans have told the Israelis, if Hezbollah launches a full-scale war against Israel, we are with you and will participate in your defense. But if you launch a full-scale war against Lebanon, you're on your own. I mean, to put it very simplistically. That may well be the message that has been the message of restraint that has been sent to Israel by Washington. But given how we've seen the Biden administration respond to Israeli violations, let's say, of US policy preferences in the Gaza Strip, given that it is an election year, if Israel launches a full-scale war against Lebanon, do we really think that John Kirby is going to get up in the White House and say, we told the Israelis, if you're the one that initiates full-scale war, you're on your own, and so we're having no part of this? Of course not. And I think Israeli calculations are that they would ideally like to see a war against Hezbollah in which Israel does not have to fight alone, because it can't fight alone, and it would like to see the US directly participate in this. And in an ideal scenario, this would lead to a direct confrontation between the US and Iran, because again, Israel talks big, but aside from nuking Tehran, it doesn't really have a military option vis-a-vis Iran.
And what you mentioned about Gantz, sorry, Benny Gantz is the former defense minister, currently.
Yes, but sorry, I was speaking about Gallant.
Oh, Gallant. Okay. All right. Yeah. So, which probably partly explains the visit by the former defense minister Benny Gantz to Washington. So, currently there's a rift between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, who is part of the war cabinet set up by Netanyahu. He's in Washington right now, and apparently there was heated exchange between him and Gantz, Netanyahu and Gantz, and Netanyahu apparently said that, who exactly is the prime minister here? I'm the prime minister here. So Gantz is in the US against, Netanyahu's wishes, and he's meeting with all the senior officials. So is this really a signal to Netanyahu that your time is up, and we're thinking of post-Netanyahu scenarios. And also, it kind of adds more weight to your claim that if Gantz was in power, who he's most likely going to be the next prime minister if Netanyahu is kicked out, that adds further credence to what you're saying, that, maybe this is the scenario, and if Gantz is in power, yes, go and invade Lebanon, we will be with you.
Yes, although my suspicion is that Gantz has severely miscalculated. Um, Gantz is looking at these growing differences, or what he perceives to be growing differences between Washington and Netanyahu. Gantz knows and understands that at the personal level, Netanyahu is loathed by his sponsors in Washington. Gantz understands that Washington would very much like to see, at the minimum, a different Israeli coalition government, and ideally a different Israeli government altogether, which would not drag the West's name through the mud 24/7 and around the clock. But if Gantz is acting on the supposition that the Biden administration is going to take active measures to cut Netanyahu down to size and essentially force him from power, the way that, for example, the Bush senior administration did with Yitzhak Shamir in 91, 92, he's in for a surprise, because that's simply not going to happen. Secondly, I think Netanyahu is a much more seasoned and adept politician than is Gantz, and my suspicion is that Netanyahu will make mincemeat out of Gantz. So I don't at all disagree with your premise that setting the stage for a Gantz succession is very much his agenda for this visit to Washington. But I think the premise that Washington is actually going to take meaningful initiatives to help make it happen, and secondly, that Gantz can outflank and outsmart Netanyahu are not two premises that I endorse.
I think we should add to that Netanyahu is the most successful Israeli prime minister. He's being monstered everywhere, US, Western allies as well, but he's been the most successful. Israeli society love him. I know there's protests now, but you don't get to win, I think, 4 elections or 5, if I'm not mistaken, if you're not charismatic, if the public don't like you. So it's just now he's become, or is presented as a decisive figure. And we should also, I think, point out the fact that if Gantz was to become, whoever becomes a prime minister after Netanyahu, on the Palestinian side, there's likely to be hardly any difference in how they approach the occupation. Gantz himself is opposed to a two-state solution. So I don't know what we could expect, other than some window dressing, other than some softer versions in the statements that are issued, what we could expect with Gantz as Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, it will be cosmetically more convenient for Israel's sponsors in Washington and Brussels. The iron fist and the velvet glove, if you will. Netanyahu has a lot of personal baggage, is deeply loathed and mistrusted, but also unconditionally supported. And I think having someone like Gantz, a fresh face who sounds more reasonable when rejecting Palestinian rights, who engages in mass murder with a smile, would obviously be much preferred in Western capitals. But as you rightly point out, on the ground, very little would change.
We spoke quite a bit about Biden and the election in Michigan, where 100,000 voters, non-committed voters.
I believe it may have been 130,000.
130,000. Okay. Okay. So that raises a question. I mean, the idea that Biden would risk re-election by continuing his support for Netanyahu and a fascist Israeli government, to a lot of people, it makes no sense. So And bear in mind, Netanyahu prefers someone like Trump. He prefers the Republicans. Their objectives align much closer with the Republicans than they do with the Democrats. So why does Biden continue to offer support and prop up this regime in Tel Aviv? And sometimes I wonder, if we have to throw away some of our conventional understandings about politics and the manner in which politicians make decisions. In this case, you'd say, okay, this is not looking good in the polls for me. There's voters who want me to sympathize, empathize, show empathy to the Palestinians. I'm not doing that. That's how normal politicians would respond. They look at the electorates, look at the mood, and change their position. But Biden, for whatever reason, or not just Biden, many US presidents do not make calculations on Israel-Palestinians in that way. So I think, is it time we just say, look, throw away any kind of conventional understanding when it comes to Israel-Palestine. US presidents will risk their future, will risk re-election, no matter what, for the sake of Israel.
I think it's fair to say that in the past, most US presidents have supported Israel for a variety of reasons. They've supported it on the perception that it is a powerful proxy securing Western interests in the Middle East. They have supported it in the broader context of the Cold War. And let's not forget, they have also supported it because support for Israel used to be an electorally intelligent approach. You lost votes by mentioning Palestinians. You lost a lot of votes if you suggested Palestinians are entitled to rights. But if you support Israel and its wars and its occupation and its apartheid and so on, you win votes. I think the reason we're having this discussion, Nasim, is because this is gradually beginning to change. I mean, you didn't ask me whether Biden is worried about losing the elections because he's criticizing and condemning Israel, which is certainly the question you would have been posing to me in previous election cycles. You're asking me, why is Biden blindly supporting Israel, even if it's going to cost him, and it will cost him electorally? So that, I think, is a major and very positive development. And we saw it also last week in the UK with
George Galloway.
drubbing of the Labour Party. And so I think that the point is that when Western politicians begin to lose rather than gain votes and lose rather than gain popular support because of their alignment with Israel, that's a sea change, and it's very positive and to be encouraged. Regarding your specific question about Biden, he's a cold warrior. He's also a self-proclaimed Zionist. I mean, imagine that an American president gets up and says, if it weren't for Israel, no Jew in the world would be safe. So this is a president of the most powerful country in the world, basically saying that if Israel doesn't exist, I wouldn't be able to secure the lives of Jewish Americans. I mean, it defies imagination. But the point I'm getting at is that Biden is genuinely, ideologically, politically committed to Israel. Yes, he loathes Netanyahu. Yes, he doesn't have much time for Ben Gvir and Smotrich and some of these other Looney Tunes. But he's standing shoulder to shoulder with them because from his perspective, he's standing shoulder to shoulder with his favorite state, Israel, not necessarily these individuals. Israel for him is a matter of principle. Israel for him is a matter of ideological conviction. And when you hold such principles so strongly and so near and dear, they're worth sacrificing for. I genuinely believe that at least for Biden, losing the November election, because of his attachment, his passionate attachment to Israel, because of his deep support for Israel, is, from his perspective, a price worth paying.
Yeah, it may well be. And I think next person that comes along and realizes that Biden lost because of his support for Israel, I think that would be a seismic shift, not just in the US, but also here in the UK, where there is a growing constituency of voters who want a third party. They don't have an option with Labour, Lib Dems, and the Conservatives. If there was a genuine option which is more progressive, which offers a more compassionate form of politics, more moral, ethical foreign policy, I think there's an appetite for that, and Galloway has shown that. And I think in America, you'll probably realize that they'll realize that as well if Biden loses the next election.
Yeah, and if I, yes, so if I could just interrupt to make one more point. The irony here is that, of course, all due credit to the Palestinian people and the Palestinian solidarity movement in these countries. But if there is one individual who is responsible for these transformations more than any other, ironically enough, it's Benjamin Netanyahu. Um, Israel's most important strategic asset by far since 1948 has been the bipartisan wall-to-wall support for Israel and its policies in the United States. The initiative to transform Israel into a partisan issue in US politics was very much a Netanyahu project. The decision to identify support for Israel with the far right in Europe rather than make it a consensus among Christian Democrats and social democrats and liberals and so on was very much an Israeli project. So in a sense, Israel is now reaping what it sowed.
And I think you make a very important point there. And if you were to draw a Venn diagram of who supports Israel in the West, the socialists and many of the liberals, Christian Democrats, they are losing their faith in Israel. And more, the Venn diagram aligns perfectly with the far-right extremists and the fascists of Europe, who see in Israel a model of the kind of country they want to create, which is why they support Israel.
Yeah, exactly. And I think particularly since 2001 and the attacks on New York and Washington, which coincided with the Second Intifada and Israel's suppression of the Palestinians. As you said, Israel is not only a model for them of the kind of apartheid society, illiberal society they want to create, but Israel for them is also the model of how you deal with these upstart natives and darker peoples, and specifically how you deal with Muslims. So, and it's quite astonishing the extent to which Israel and its flunkies and apologists in the West have invested in Islamophobia as a strategic project. It's absolute madness if you were to look at this, let's say, impartially, neutrally, from the perspective of what would best serve Israeli interests. I mean, is creating a religious war between Jews and Muslims really in Israel's best interest? We may find out in very few days, given all these initiatives to light the Haram al-Sharif on fire. I hope just figuratively, but these people who think apocalypse and Armageddon are not only a good thing, but strategic objectives, it really boggles the mind.
And I think we'll end on that. And I am fearful of Ramadan because of the kind of policies that are being enacted. Ben Gvir is trying to stop Palestinians from praying in Haram al-Sharif during Ramadan. So that
Yes,
will,
including Palestinian citizens of Israel. But of
yeah,
course, it's not an apartheid state.
yeah. I think we'll cover that next week if there are any developments. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani. Thank you, Mouin,
Thank you very much,
for your
Nasim.
thoughts. And thank you for tuning in, and see you next week for another episode of Memo Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. Bye-bye.